Good evening and welcome to the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association Part 2 discussion on the media's role in engendering trust and giving voice to marginalized communities. I'm Lucido Canto, Executive Vice President and Managing Director of BCW Global, and a proud member of the Board of Directors for MMCA. George Floyd's murder and the many recent tragic episodes of injustice have ignited a deep debate and soul-searching about racism, inequality, and racial justice in America. In this historic moment of change, there's an ever greater need, now more than ever, for media to break down the walls of prejudice and ignorance and bring attention to the underrepresented in the voice of those who are otherwise voiceless, instead of helping to fuel misrepresentations of others and contributing to the divides that separate us. As Toni Morrison taught us, definitions belong to the definers, not the definition. Diversity in media matters, and now is the time to define our story, ensure it reflects the rich diversity of this country and also the realities of our own community. I now invite you to watch a brief video on MMCA and how we are moving the needle on media diversity.
We see a media diversity crisis with serious economic, social, and political implications. 40% of the population have no ownership in an industry that represents 20% of the economy. Media bias and stereotyping is fanning the fire of hatred and division. Dying local news outlets are crippling civic engagement. And worst of all, not seeing positive stories about their community is stifling the dreams and aspirations of Black and brown children across this nation.
We hosted the inaugural Multicultural Media Correspondents Dinner to ignite a call to action to move the needle on media diversity.
We don't just tell colored stories. We tell stories in color.
During the dinner, we honored multicultural media luminaries who all shared their struggles and highlighted the need for increased media diversity.
Not enough to shore. It takes money, it takes capital.
It has to be multicultural. It has to be people coming together.
There's no way to create that cultural change without the authentic voices.
Stories of multicultural people have tremendous value.
In order to harness and sustain the energy and power of the MMCD, we formed the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association, and it quickly became a powerful platform. MMCA serves as a trusted bridge and convener, enabling difficult, solutions-focused conversations in a common ground environment. It serves as a vehicle to provide thought leadership. It effectively influences and communicates policy developments.
You have to just go at it as if you have the same rights that everyone else has to do what you need to do to fulfill your dream.
And it provides information and resources for both individuals and stakeholder organizations. Most notably, MMCA has worked with Representative Demings to introduce resolutions that reaffirms Congress's support for media diversity. We ask that journalists and media professionals join our community and become diversity champions, and that media companies and stakeholder groups become strategic partners by providing funding and support. Together, we can move the needle on media diversity. Thank you.
I'm now pleased to introduce you to MMCA co-founder and president, David Morgan.
Thank you, Lisi, and thank you to the entire board and MMCA family. Really appreciate all you guys do. I also want to thank our media partners, Verizon Media and Yahoo News, for choosing to be part of the solution and now allowing us to leverage your platform. And now, without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator for our conversation today, my Cornell buddy and friend, Ramses Jean-Louis, Global Head of Diversity for Verizon Media. Take it away, Ramses.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. We have a great panel with us tonight for our part 2 of the media's role in engendering trust and giving voice to marginalized communities in partnership with MMCA Verizon Media, and Yahoo News. First, let's go to video. Before we get started with our panel, we have a very special guest that will dive into our country's pressing issues, the media's role in shaping the narrative of current events, and how we can best provide voice to underrepresented communities. Representative Jim Clyburn is the majority whip, the third-ranking Democrat in the United States House of Representatives, and currently serves as the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis. He is also the chairman of the Rural Broadband Task Force and Democratic Faith Working Group. As a national leader, he has championed rural and economic development, and many of his initiatives have become law. And his memoir, titled Blessed Experiences, Genuinely Southern, Proudly Black, was published in 2015 and has been described as a primer that should be read by every student interested in pursuing a career in public service. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The country is erupting in protest over police brutality and systemic oppression. I want to talk about the media's role, but first, I want to ask you, how did we get here?
Well, we got here basically because we have never given honest pursuit to that trek leading to liberty and justice for all. The fact of the matter is we just finished celebrating Juneteenth. We know Juneteenth, it celebrates that date back in 1865 that General Granger went to Texas to let the African Americans know there that they were free. That was 30 months after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we know what ensued from that point on. It was only 10 years after that that these so-called, we'll talk about what may or may not have happened during Reconstruction. Reconstruction didn't last for 12 years. And it was followed by a period of what we now call Jim Crow. And so the country never really got serious about undertaking a pursuit until 1954, when the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, set out to desegregate schools. And you know what happened as a result of that. And so throughout the years, the country has gone left for a while, then we'll go back right for a while, then we'll go back left for a while. And we saw all of that happen in a compressed period in the last few years. Going off to the left, electing Barack Obama. Going way back to the right, in electing Donald Trump. And now we see that the country is at an inflection point. So we got here because we've never been honest about what we need to do in order to fulfill that pledge of liberty and justice for all.
You've mentioned, in fact, the civil rights movement. So you were a young man when the civil rights movement took place in the 50s and 60s. What are some similarities and differences between 60 years ago and what's going on with the current movement?
All the similarities are there. If you look at what's going on today, we were doing it. You know, John Lewis was the martyr in all of this. I mean, he was and the model for all of us. He internalized things a lot of us didn't. I never really internalized nonviolence. John did. The commitment that people are showing today, it's very similar. Here's what's different. Back then, we had nobody with the relevant experiences that we could sit down with or that we could call upon. There were things that happened before us. I tell people all the time, I mean, they say, you were part of the civil rights movement. No, I was part of one segment of it. The civil rights movement going on since 1822, and even before, if you go back to the Stonewall Rebellion. So there's always been a civil rights movement, but there's never been a movement that had the benefit of the experiences that John Lewis has and many others. that had 50 some odd people of color sitting in the United States Congress that could introduce legislation and respond as quickly as Karen Bass has as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. This piece of legislation that we're going to vote on tomorrow and we will pass out of the House tomorrow, we had nothing like that back in the 60s. We had to pay homage to white benevolence in order to get anything done in the Congress. And they responded in a bipartisan way. Lyndon Johnson did great work, but I think that he wouldn't have done it successfully without what does Jay, I'll tell about, my wife was always pleased that we never had sons because I was going to name my son Jay after J. Everett Dirksen.
You've mentioned special thanks to Representative James Clyburn for helping us kick off this conversation. Like I mentioned, we have an amazing panel tonight to help us tackle some very pressing issues. Our first panelist is Bo Tao Arabe, Executive and Network Director of Coalition of Asian American Leaders. We have MJ Rodriguez from the award-nominated show Pose. I'm a big fan of MJ's and the show. She's also a singer, actress, and activist. Star Parker. She's one of the names mentioned when anyone speaks of national Black conservative leaders. She is founder of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education and a regular commentator on television and radio networks, including BBC and Fox News. We are also joined by Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, former mayor of Baltimore and recipient of First Citizen Award by the Maryland State Senate and many other awards. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. As you all know, we are in the middle of a healthcare crisis, a racial crisis, as well as a financial crisis.
So I can't hear. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can't hear you. I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me now? One of the first questions that we're actually going to start off with is I would like to ask all of our panelists one word that they can come up with to describe how they're feeling right now, how they're doing. What's that one word that captures how are you doing? But also, if you could just share some tips in terms of how have you been able to manage your mental health and stay balanced during these times? I'll actually start with Bo.
Hi, Ram. Thanks for having me and good to be with everybody. I think my one word would be evolutionary. I have been feeling like this is such a moment for our country and for a lot of people personally. I know that being here in some ways at what was the epicenter and now has gone all across the country and the globe really gives me a glimpse of this community and that sense of what it's like. So that's how I'm feeling at this moment.
Thank you, Bo. Star, how about you? Can't hear you, Star. I'm not sure if you're on mute. We'll circle back.
I'm muted my mic.
Okay, fantastic.
So my one word is opportunity. I mean, when you think about the Chinese symbol for crises, it has both danger and opportunity in that same symbol. And I think that with all the danger that we've been in as a nation of late with the COVID and now with these racial tensions, it gives us all an opportunity to reflect, to refresh, to set our priorities in perspective, and then to clear out the clutter and start getting to meaningful dialogue and meaningful discussions, which is why I appreciate being here with you on this important topic of how do we diversify the media.
Thank you, Star. I agree with you. When you take a look at the tragedies that's taken place with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, we really want to make sure that their deaths were not in vain. So we are in the middle of a crisis, but we really don't want to let this crisis go by without us using this opportunity to make things better. So thank you for that. MJ, how about yourself?
Well, first and foremost, hello, everybody who's on the panel. It's a pleasure being here with all of y'all, and thank you, Ram. I think my word is driven. and this is more specifically geared towards the generations that are behind me. I think it's a time now to influence the generations that are younger and that are also behind me to keep fighting and make sure that they stay adamant in letting their voices speak up, because their voices deserve to be heard. We're obviously, like both of these women have said, we're in times now where there's a lot of things being brought to the bud of the flower, and now it's time to address it.
Thank you, MJ. So the first question that I have actually has to do with this racial crisis that we're in. It's the same question that I asked Representative Clyburn. How did we get here? I would love to get your thoughts on that. Star, I'll start with you.
Well, how we got here, in my opinion, is we got lost as a society, in particular as a Black community of people during the 60s upon the signing of the Civil Rights Act into law. When we saw this disruption in our communities at that time, in our society at that time, with it being compounded not just by Johnson looking at a political solution to poverty, but also to the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the death of Bobby Kennedy, and then within 5 years of those deaths to have Roe v. Wade as national law, to where we stopped focusing on humanity and started focusing on political interest and concern. So how we got here is because we started looking to the legislators for answers that perhaps we should have addressed ourselves. When you think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, I've assessed it into three different parts. He was talking to three different people. In the beginning, he talked to the country at large. In the middle, he talked to us, the Black community, the Negro, he called it at the time. And then in the end, he talked to those that were of faith, of his faith, people that would recognize the Christianity that drives our Constitution and our capitalism and our civil society. Well, when he talked to the Black community in that middle, he said the work is done. He said, go back into your communities and build. And I think that we missed an opportunity by coming to Washington, D.C., and then building on programs and upon programs to now have such a divide in our society that we're still talking about race, racism, and racial matters.
Thank you, Star. MJ, what are your thoughts?
I think one of the reasons we got here is because a lot of history has been just disproportionately displaced from our minds as a culture. And when I say that, I'm talking about the generation that comes behind me. And I think that we constantly have to instill that within them. And there are a lot of people outside of the melanin groups, like myself and the individuals who are on this panel. They don't know the history like how they need to know it. And I think that this is more of a time to really engage and give the conversation. I love that this is a panel that centers around multiculturalism, because that's what our goal is. At the end of the day, I mean, a trickle effect happens, but once you start addressing the trickle effects, you can have an effective way of multiculturalism. So that's what I think happened.
Thank you, MJ.
No problem.
Bo, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, as other folks have mentioned before, that we have not lived up to our full potential as a country. And in many ways, we have been reactionary, and I think in particular in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, where we may have spoken the language of movements, but not necessarily practiced it. And I think that oftentimes we haven't really listened to those who have been most impacted by injustice or oppression, and letting them be our teachers and letting them lead to tell us, taking those lessons to say what has to change. And so, the few have protected power for themselves, and I think that entrenched in our systems are rules and laws that are that breathe in our everyday lives, that create the conditions for a lot of the inequities that we see. So I know, as somebody who works on policy, while it's true, we should be going into our communities to build, and that is extremely critical, and I would say is one of the reasons why our communities are so resilient. But we also have to go into the house of the hallways of policymakers, because those are the places that create rules and decide what to do with the resources that we all share. And unfortunately, those roles and those resources have not been distributed equitably to all communities, and in particular, Black community demands over our country's history. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why we are where we are at, but much of it has to do with what we have embedded into our systems.
Thank you, Bo. I'd like to actually, build on that and build on your comments. You actually said in an interview on the Minnesota Public Radio News that without focus, divisions will continue to run deep between communities of color, and the systemic racism will remain intact. Can you expand on that and help us unpack that?
Sure. I mean, I think as somebody that has spent much of my life really building my own community, but also having to unlearn and relearn much of my country's history. I came here as a refugee child, so I have to say when I landed here with my family, I did not understand the history of this country, and it took me a long time doing the work to be able to understand that. And I would say throughout history, there have been attempts to really pivot Asian communities against Black communities. And it's a tactic that encourages us to turn on each other rather than to tackle our common oppression, which is really, a system of white supremacy in my eyes. And those efforts distract us from really creating real solutions that build cross-racial solidarity to root out racism in our systems. And so while I think that Asian Americans and the very concept of the model minority myth was really created to not respond to Black community demands, right? So I understand that, and I think it's really important for me to do this work, having that historical context so that I can build with my own community to understand that in this moment of COVID, when we are being blamed for causing the virus, it's important that the conditions or the positive attributes of being named a model minority is a myth. And in times like this, we remember that our status is conditional and subjected to being taken away by xenophobia, right? So it's important for me to have that historical context of this country and then to work in movement with other communities, Indigenous, Black, Latinx communities, because we all share a lot of common struggles. And unless we work together, it's easy to become siloed and think that each of our struggles are so different.
Thank you, Bo. I appreciate that. You touched on a lot of great points. One, talking about unity among communities of color. How do we bring that about? How do we foster that? Because, we all have certain obstacles and hurdles that we face, and it will take all of us to overcome that together. You've also touched upon the concept of how do we make sure that we provide resources for communities that may be in need. I think specifically when we take a look at COVID-19, we've realized that it's had greater impact on, African-American community and the Latinx community. We also realize in light of what's taking place with COVID-19, our Asian brothers and sisters are being attacked from a discrimination standpoint. And it will only take all of us to work together in order to be able to overcome that. So I would love to get other members of the panel to be able to weigh in as well. Stephanie, we were just talking and catching up on how did we get here and to kind of understand what are some of those underlying conditions. And then this way we'll be able to address those particular issues. So Stephanie, I'll start with you to see what are your thoughts on this?
So first, I think Congressman Clyburn, in his remarks about how we got here, I think he really said it all. Our country has not dealt with its racist history. I think we've had fits and starts, and I think we are in the midst of another start that is a reckoning. And I appreciate what he said about that it's different now, because when he was actively involved in part of the civil rights movement, there was no congressional Black caucus. Now there is. And as someone who was motivated to enter public service because of people like Congressman Clyburn and all of the civil rights leaders that went before me, I think it's important to understand that there are people who choose service not to maintain the status quo, but inspired by the great leaders that went before us, choose public service, elected office to be a part of the change that we want to see in our community.
Thank you, Stephanie. MJ, I would love to get your thoughts as well.
I know my standpoint kind of keeps going back to generational. I think that's the main focus for me, because there are individuals that are behind me and there are individuals that are before me that don't have the understanding of the Black movement, who don't have the understanding of different cultures around the world. And I think we have to, most importantly, alongside what a lot of these women have said, is acknowledge the history, but also acknowledge the struggle and try to see how we can work around it. There is a reckoning, Stephanie, I agree 100%. And I think that it constantly needs to happen. I think we should also address what the considered marginalized groups are, but also come out of it and take back who we are as a people who started a lot of things, who started a lot when it comes to our culture. I'm in hope that things will change, but we all know that it takes time as well. So with that being said, I think these are the necessary steps, and hopefully the people within all types of walks of life understand the one that's happening now, and it's specifically geared towards melanin Black lives.
Thank you, MJ. Appreciate that. Star, I would love to get your opinion as well. I know in corporate America, the conversation that we've been having really have been revolving around systemic racism and the impact that that has had on the African-American community. So one of the things that we're talking about in the discussion is how do we support the African-American community in light of systemic racism and the obstacles that that has created over time. Would love to get your thoughts.
Well, in order to answer that question, I would have to buy into this idea that I believe there is systemic racism. I don't. One of the challenges that I have with some of this discussion is that we all are supposed to buy into the same mission just based on our ethnicity. Some people want to just be free and not look to purge racism because they believe, including myself, that you'll never purge racism. You're talking acts of heart. What we want to do, though, is have a civil environment to where we all can prosper and live in peace, that we will all be protected by the law. So that's where the public policy does come in. That's where we can say, are there things that we can change so that people will feel that they are a part of this society? When you mention corporate America, for instance, one of the biggest challenges that we are having is that when we moved into the 70s after the civil rights era, we started looking at racial preference programs and affirmative action programs to try to further the interests of African Americans, as opposed to just letting individuals rise and where there were challenges for them to litigate. I think that we overfocus sometimes and we lose sight of differences in our community, in particular when those differences are rooted in different worldviews.
Thank you, Star. Appreciate that. And I would love to perhaps get a little bit of background on the organization that you started. In fact, you're the president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, also known as CURE. One of your many objectives is to create public policy that transitions poor Americans from government dependency to economic independence. How does that look like? What does that look like?
It looks like more freedom and ownership. And these are ideas that keep getting lost when we try to collectively just look at racism and the challenges that occur when somebody runs into a challenge in this area. When you talk about freedom and ownership, we should be looking to remove governmental barriers. Like, for instance, we want freedom and ownership in personal retirement accounts. We believe that if you own Wall Street, your tendency is to make sure that it thrives. And you can only do that when you buy stock, when you're engaged in the marketplace. But when you're disproportionately poor, then you don't have the resources to be able to invest. So we think that money should go to IRAs instead of the IRS when it comes to personal retirement accounts, as opposed to Social Security. We should allow for people to choose. We also believe that parents should have the right to send their children to schools they want, that money should follow parents to go to children to schools that parents want. So that means that we have to open up opportunities for that to occur. So that means removing the governmental barriers of forcing children into particular public schools. So I think when we start thinking beyond the ideas of purging racism from places that others might determine that they can find it, and we start getting into what it really will take to bridge that gap, that income gap, and to build net worth, and we might find some solutions that are more equitable for everyone just to live free with any associations they want.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that I understand. So it sounds like we're all in agreement that we've identified certain gaps in the justice system, in the healthcare system, in the education system, and in corporate America. And it seems as if we're attributing that racism has had an impact on those gaps. There's a school of thought that we need to address systemic racism in order to really get to the heart of the issue. It appears as if, and correct me if I'm wrong, keep me honest, you're saying that that's not necessarily the course that we need to take in order to address it. Racism has contributed, but we don't necessarily need the focus to be on racism. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm saying that when we say that there are places that we can see racial disparities, that we should look deeper than for systemic racism. For instance, you mentioned in healthcare and the disproportionate number of African Americans that are dying from COVID-19 and or going to hospital. We stay with that narrative thinking that that means we should build bigger government involvement in the healthcare industry, as opposed to saying, wait just a minute, when you look a little bit deeper, you find out that it's Medicaid and these government-owned nursing homes where we started seeing much of the conflict. So I think that we should just have more opportunities to talk about freedom and ownership and how we can really serve those in need outside of government.
Thank you, Star. Stephanie, I would love to get your thoughts in this as being the former mayor of Baltimore. What is the best way, or what is an approach that you think would work well, a good strategy moving forward in terms of how do we address some of these racist issues that takes place in our society?
So it's interesting. I enjoy listening to Star's perspective, and when I listen to Star, it reminds me of how important it is for us to stay focused on our shared goals and not necessarily what we call them. I think too often we have litmus tests for whether or not, particularly I'm a Democrat, particularly on the Democratic side, it hurts us. Litmus test for whether or not we can support someone. So if someone is unwilling to say that systemic racism is a problem, you're canceled. If you're unwilling to say that you should defund the police, you're canceled. I really feel that there are enough things that we want. We share in common. So when Star was talking about the health disparities, that was something that was very important to me as mayor. So whether or not she believes in that there's a systemic racism or not, that is an area bridging or closing the gap when it comes to health disparities in our community. That is something that I see that we would be able to work on together. And I hope that instead of focusing so much on well, where do you stand on this issue? Where do you stand on this issue? We have enough in common, a shared vision, I think, of where we want to be, which is in better position, that we can work on those things together without focusing on the divides. And I just wanted to add one other thing. I had some technical difficulties at the beginning, and I wanted to say how grateful I am to be a part of this conversation with all of you, and to tell MJ in particular, out of all of my accomplishments, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and it wasn't until she saw that I was on a panel with you that she thought that I had accomplished something. So thank you very much for making me cool for 1 hour in the eyes of my 16-year-old.
Of course, anytime.
Thank you, Stephanie. I love your point in terms of how can we collaborate, how can we make sure that we don't have litmus tests. I think that really builds on what Bo was talking about in terms of how do we bring our communities together for the common goal. So Bo, I'd love to bring you into this conversation as well, just to get your input.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate Mayor Rawlings' comments about that, because I do think that, doing this work, we've been able to work on both sides of the aisles because we are focused on what's the outcome and that there are many possible solutions, right, to get to that same outcome. And so in particular, when it comes to economics, I do think that what is important is that we also just don't look at ourselves, and that we think about our whole communities, and we don't do away with data that tell us that there are generational poverty issues, and that is not just a personal responsibility, but there are conditions that deserve our attention, so that we can help to eliminate some of those conditions. So I do agree that when we think about the future and when we think about the possibilities, we have to tap into all the assets that we have as a community. I would say there's so much brilliance in our communities that sometimes go unseen, right? Because we maybe don't have the belief factor ourselves, but also we may not necessarily know how to do certain things or get the kinds of investments that we deserve. But I have also seen that there are real conditional challenges that lie in the way of our communities being able to get those things. And so I do agree that there are ways in which we can work on common goals, and then we should not forget when we have data and historical facts that tell us that certain communities are continuously left behind, and that is all of our both interest, self and collective interest to do that, because when we can raise the bottom, then it helps all of us, right? Because there is a societal cost to all of us if we don't pay attention to what happens to students who are at the bottom, to what happens to families who have generational poverty. All of those things are important to us, and there's a collective interest there. So I just want to say, I do think there is both a personal and a collective responsibility to work on things together.
Thank you, Bo. I appreciate that. So one of the things that we touched on was defunding the police. And I know there's a wide variety of different perspectives on that. I would love to actually start with you, Stephanie, and then go to MJ to get your thoughts in general in terms of what does police reform look like? What should it look like? And is defunding the police a viable option for us to consider?
I think it's, when you say defund the police, it means so many different things to so many different people. I think it's hard to say in broad strokes that defunding the police makes sense across the board. I do think it's important for us to rethink policing across the country. And I was a very strong supporter of police reform and the work that I did as mayor. And what I know is that it is work that, as MJ says, it does take time. That the advocacy and the trying to right the ship when you have generations of these systems, it takes time. So what I would say is we need to rethink policing. We need to be open to what that looks like. And I think it's very personal and very specific to the community, because the communities in Baltimore aren't necessarily looking for the same thing as in the outskirts of Philadelphia or in Phoenix or anywhere else. You have to be open to what policing looks like in your community, and try to work to fund the police at a level that gives you that gives communities the safety that they need and deserve. My fear in this effort to defund the police and the knee-jerk reactions that are going around across the country is, my fear is that the most vulnerable communities will pay the worst price. We don't have any guarantees what defunding police means to those communities that suffer the most with violence on a day-to-day basis. And communities that are vulnerable are also the ones that are marginalized when it comes to understanding their franchise or their ability to engage in government in a way to make sure that they are protected. So my concern is that, that someone continues to speak up for the least of us as we talk about defunding the police, so that the communities that live with violence on a day-to-day basis aren't further limited by the efforts to rethink policing.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before we go to MJ and Star to respond as well, I just want to remind everyone that we will be opening this up for Q&A. So we want to hear your comments, we want to hear your voice, and we especially want to hear your questions. So please feel free to send in your questions. With that, I'll turn the mic over to you, MJ. I'd love to get your thoughts on what does police reform, what should it look like?
Well, first and foremost, I agree solely with Stephanie on this one. And on a broader scale, what it looks like to me is finally getting in space police officers who can actually do right by the citizens of the world, right? As she said, it's a broad stroke to see how that would work, being as though there are different circumstances that happen in different areas. And if we were to completely defund the police, it would result into a lot of chaos, right? So instead, in the broad scheme of it all, I think of when a police officer goes in for 6 months compared to a firefighter. That's something that needs to be evaluated. But in order to do that, there needs to be some kind of, like I said, defunding to make sure that that can actually be reiterated, or there can be some space to create it for these police officers or these people who come into the units, who come into education for this. They need more space to learn, so that they know how to deal with the citizens of the world, citizens of the state, and citizens of this nation in general. That's what it generally looks like to me, and I hope it gets there. But that's only a hope. There's so much more to do. There's so much more to lay down. I always say there's a soil to be laid so that seeds can grow. And I think that we just need to keep laying the soil.
Thank you, MJ.
No problem.
Star, I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, you asked us about one word to define where we are in this moment in history, and I said opportunity. And I think with the discussion about police reform, it gives us an opportunity also to look at union reform over policing. I don't like the idea of nationalizing and having a bigger, heavy hand here in Washington, D.C. to start looking into very local communities and perhaps some type of oversight when there are dilemmas with police officers. But what we're finding out now that there's such a focus on this particular area is that, on a local level, they've negotiated union contracts to where in many of our hardest hit communities, the officers of those communities can't live there. Well, this doesn't do much for community development and community interaction. I think that we should rethink how this is done when it comes to the overemphasis of unions to protect those that are bad actors. We see it all the time, and not just with police unions. We see it in teachers' unions. We see where the rookies and the rebels end up in poor communities. And in poor communities where we already have a lot of brokenness, it escalates to tensions that then we discuss nationally. So the fact that we're having this conversation is really good, but I think that we should put all of the issues on the table so that we can have much better access to local policing that is community oriented. I think that number two, we should look at branding these community servants that want to protect, that are driven to that protection, so that we will have more African Americans and other people of color wanting to become police officers of their own communities. This will help us build healthier environments, especially as we've seen the collapse of family and marriage in most of our hard-hit zip codes.
Thank you, Star. Bo, I would love to get your thoughts on what should police reform look like?
Yeah. I don't have much more to add, except that I think that I agree with the sentiment that what this demand has enabled is for people to put on the table the things that they would want instead in their communities in order for people to feel safe, to feel like they have investments in their communities, and to also continue to build communities, right? I agree with Star that there is a sentiment amongst a lot of folks that if you have officers who don't live in your community and are and are willing to police your community but are not contributing to building your community, I think there's a lot lost there, right? So I do think that those are the things that we are hearing about. When I talk to young people, what they want is an investment in who they are and their potential and, you know, the ideas. And so if we can put on the table, what else would we do instead? That helps to build community vitality and to build up businesses and to build up, ensure that kids feel like they can be academically successful without being policed and things like that. I think those are all good things. And so I think what it is, what it has done by putting defund the police as the agenda is that it has created those opportunities for reimagination.
I wonder if I can add something here, because I really appreciate what Bo just said, because, and just to elaborate on one point, the overwork that the police are now asked to do, you kind of mentioned it in passing, this community work that the police are asked to do. They're not there to be our social workers. So it is healthy that we're having these types of discussions to see if there are other areas in these local communities to where we can pull strength and energy and help so that the police are not doing it all, and which would then free them up to do what they're supposed to do, which is catch the bad guys.
Thank you, Star. We have a lot of great questions coming in. I have a couple of more questions for the panel before we open it up to Q&A. My first question, I'm going to direct it to you, MJ. Wanted to touch on some news that came out last week. The landmark Supreme Court decision recognizing that workplace discrimination based on an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity is prohibited by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What are your thoughts on this decision, and what does it mean to you personally?
I think the decision has been, it was kind of defining to see on the news that it was passed, because it just not only beat out a stride that we've been trying to fight for as a community of LGBTQAI plus individuals, but it also showed the fight that we're fighting with, and as a person who is Black, who identifies as female, who identifies as Latinx, it shows that we're fighting alongside a lot of many topics that are happening now. And it was great to see on television. What it looks like to me is that there's still work that needs to be done, because there are still places within even my own community that need to be fixed. This is just only the first step, and there are many steps that need to be taken in order for our lives as people, just in general. And I agree with you, Star, from the first moment that you spoke about everyone coming together. My idea of the human race is us being together generally as a human race, right? But there are certain things that trickle down after the human race that we have to shed light on. One of them being the Black lives that are being lost, one of them being the injustices that are happening, like Bo mentioned, with individuals who are Asian in different areas, and when it comes to African American people, and obviously the one that we mentioned right now, which is the LGBTQAI plus community, who is disproportionately displaced due to who they are, and obviously what other people have when it comes to their ideals and differences and beliefs. I think that this is the first step, but there is more work that needs to be done. I think if I can speak specifically to the younger generation of the African American community, I implore them to constantly be open and understanding, and not be thwarted by the many things that they may see or may hear, or what the ideals or stigma of a woman like myself or a trans man is. Instead, open your minds to speak about it, talk about it, and have the discussion. And this was the first step to that. We had a lot against us. Everyone had a lot against them in this time. But with this being passed by the individual who is in office now, it also showed a lot of resistance to us as human beings. And the win, to me, was such a great stride and a great step to moving the needle forward. And I think there still needs to be more work done.
Thank you, MJ. I agree with you 100%. I definitely think it's a win. It's a win for diversity. It's a win for inclusion. Making sure that when you make sure that one group of human beings cannot be discriminated against and that everyone has the right to justice, that's a win for humankind just overall. So you are right. It is a step in the right direction, but it's a first step, and there's still a long way for us to go. Bo, I'd love to put you into this conversation as well. What are your thoughts on the decision? And if you could also perhaps chime in terms of what are your thoughts of what does allyship mean and represent?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that, I really applaud that decision along with the other decisions on DACA students, which impacts many Asian American students who who are also DACA students. And so it's a moment, I think, for us to recognize the who we are as a nation, that we have this diversity. And so the question is, what will we do to make sure that people feel fully embraced and that they can actually be and reach their full potential, because that's better for all of us, right? So I feel very much elated by the decisions, and I'm so glad because I have heard many of the stories of individuals who have felt otherwise welcome. So to see our highest court in the nation support those, make those decisions was a huge win for our community members. I think to me, allyship is really that it starts on this on the sentiment that we care about each other, right? Regardless of our struggle. Of course, I was not born in this country, and the country in which I was born in is now communist, and so I understand that we are privileged to live in a nation where we can struggle over things. It's not always going to be perfect. And so I hope that allyship is really about being able to struggle well and to struggle together to ensure that all of us can reach our full potentials and that our communities can do well generationally, not just me, but from generation to generation. I also think that it is beholden on us to learn about each other. I have to say, I went through my whole education not reading even one character that was an Asian American character, right? And I don't think that that is unusual for other, Indigenous, Black, Latinx, Asian students. And we may have more options now, but I think it's also important for us to learn and have ourselves reflected, but to also learn about other communities. If I didn't get it and I didn't learn about other people, then how could I expect that they would learn anything about me? So I feel like allyship is really about taking the opportunities to both learn about each other and to also remember and to celebrate our art and our language and our culture, because that's actually the universe of being in this country, is that we really are embracing that and saying that we bring all of that and we can build a better nation. So I hope that this is a moment for all of us to also embrace those things.
And let me know if I can add something about being an ally.
Yes, please, Stephanie, go ahead.
I would hope that when people think about being an ally, they think about the work that they can do themselves and with other allies before they put what they're feeling and they're going through on the people that are struggling. What I hear so much from other African Americans is their frustration when they are hearing from, allies or people that want to be allies, and they're hearing from it in a way that is not productive, that is further putting upon community members that are really struggling right now. It is bad enough that we are all collectively dealing with this pandemic and all of the highs and the lows that come with the roller coaster of being separated from your friends and your family, then to go through this horrific time of racial distress. Many of us, many African Americans, are truly struggling, and then to have individuals who say that they want to be allies further, kind of layer on that their struggle. I hope that people think twice about doing the work within that ally group, within themselves, before they, sort of try to purge their guilt by, making confessions to their 5 closest Black friends. because a lot of us, I think have heard enough, and are looking for some action that happens outside of us having to sign off on it.
Agreed. Thank you. Star, I'd love to get your thoughts as well with regards to the Supreme Court decision.
I think that the Orthodox community, religious community, makes incredible contributions in this country, in particular when it comes to the most vulnerable and those in most need. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they are going to work in this new environment that is in conflict with the very scriptures that they behold. And I'm hoping that as a result of them pulling out of much of their relationships and ties, that the communities that need them the most don't get severely hurt by this new secularism that has permeated our culture and our society.
Thank you, Star. We do have a couple of questions that came in on the Q&A. I do understand that we need to go to our next segment, so I will just ask one of the questions quickly. One of the questions that was posed was, how do we capitalize on this moment, and what does the path forward look like? I will toss that question to Bo.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be hopeful, right? It's a moment of tremendous pain in a lot of ways because of COVID, and then in the in the killing of George Floyd and others that have followed since that. So it might feel hard, but I would just say I am also really hopeful when I see the both personal awakenings, but then also the actions that have followed. And so for me, the way forward is if we can keep building together, and if we can keep being ambitious about what we can do together to make sure that the things that we know to be true about how communities are suffering, that those things are addressed. So. And
thank you so much. Appreciate it. At this time, I will turn it back to David Morgan, President of MMCA.
And thank you for the panelists for this awesome discussion. One of the favorite features of this platform is our ability to acknowledge multicultural media excellence. That's why we've done the multicultural version of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I'm so excited to introduce our unsung hero, Levi Rickert, who's the publisher and editor of Native News Online, one of America's most read daily newspaper for American Indian publications. Levi, glad to have you.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be here tonight.
So let's jump in. We don't have a lot of time. Tell us, how is Native News Online reporting on these social unrests bubbling across the country, and how are you ensuring that your audience is getting balanced and in-depth coverage?
Well, some of the issues have come to us, so to speak. For instance, with the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. That's where the American Indian movement was the genesis. They were formed, they're established in 1968. And so we have a really strong Native community up in Minneapolis. And with that, with the protests and the transition over into the statues, the American Indian movement removed the statue of Christopher Columbus at the state grounds of the state capitol in Minneapolis, in St. Paul. And so some of us come to us, and across the country, Southern California, there's been protests, American Indian movement down there, all about the statues and some of the things. And it's even transitioned into the name of the NFL team over in Washington, D.C. And it's not a new thing for us. I mean, for decades, we've had Native American activists really trying to do away with the racist name of that team. And so I'm happy to hear the mayor of Washington, D.C. has called for it. AOC has called for the end of the name. I think Spike Lee weighed in this week. So some of us come to us, and we've been able to just capture that and report on it. In terms of trying to be balanced, we try to be very balanced. And I think in life that's so important, very important to be balanced and not to be too far left, not to be too far right, but really try to center in on what are the real core issues that impact the lives of American Indians, and they're very numerous across the country.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the struggles you're having with reporting? I know COVID has been a disaster for a lot of local and diverse publishers. So tell us, how are you faring and what can we do to help?
Well, thank you for the question, because we've actually been at capacity level, and we received a Facebook grant, and it's now just kicking in. We've hired some reporters so far, and we still need reporters to go out into some of the local areas, and we have a national footprint, 400,000 Facebook followers, 59,000 Twitter followers. So that's been really good for us. But truly, in order for us to do a better job, we need more advertising so we can hire more reporters, and on and on. And many times American Indians are considered the forgotten minority in the United States. So David, I really do appreciate being brought in, and I don't really consider myself a hero. I'm trying to do my service, and journalists do service. And I'm a longtime community activist, advocate for decades, and I've been able to transcend into journalism, my activism, but at the same time, to your point, keep it balanced as much as possible.
Well, thank you for all you're doing, and you can count on our support. Take care.
Oh, thank you very much.
Now, I just want to share some closing thoughts. This discussion was really about the why, and I'm really glad that the panelists was able to show why it's so important that we're successful in coming up with consensus-based solutions to make sure that we have balance in our reporting, and that more importantly, we have more media, diverse media ownership and control. So be clear, I wanted you to get this from the discussion. Media has unparalleled power to influence the economic, social, and political actions and outcomes. So these discussions, making sure that we're able to bring out these diverse perspectives, are incredibly important. We also want you to stay tuned, because now we're going to move into the what and the how. And I have my colleague, Lacey, just for his closing thoughts.
Thank you, David. I couldn't agree with you more. If you want to have the kitchen table conversation, as my friends in the South have, where you have true, honest conversation, then you've come to the right place. And today's panel, and I want to thank them all together with the entire board for their amazing job, for the conversation they just had with us, is an example of just that. And moving forward, as David mentioned, we want to jump into and tackle now some of the very serious ways in which we can come together and get to those solutions, to bring this country together, to move past the anger and get to some very concrete ways in order to do that. And whether that's in looking at the issue of diverse media in terms of access to capital, which we know is an enormous issue, or what the wider media community can do to help address some of the systemic racism that exists not only within the media world, but also out in our society. These are just some of what we here at MMCA, through this series and all the work that we're doing, will be doing over the next several weeks. And we invite you to join us in this journey. It will take not just one part of America, but all of America to come together to help us, as I said at the start, define our stories. This is our time to define our stories, and join MMCA, David, myself, our board, and all of those who work with us to help us ensure that we can define our story and move the needle on diversity.